The Union Pacific station in Millbrook, Montana had been abandoned for 31 years when the train pulled in on December 17, 2025, at exactly 6:47 a.m., the same moment it had departed on that cold morning in 1978, as if the clock itself had been holding its breath all these decades and had finally decided to exhale. And when the station's rusty old signal bell began to ring on its own for the first time since the Reagan administration, the few remaining residents of the dying town, population 112 and dropping, assumed it was some kind of prank or perhaps a malfunction in the ancient equipment that the county had long since stopped maintaining. But then the whistle blew, low and mournful, and impossibly familiar to the two old men who happened to be sitting in the diner across the street, sipping coffee and watching the sun struggle to rise over the frozen plains. And Earl Thompson, who had been a 19-year-old railroad dispatcher on the day the train vanished, dropped his cup so hard that the ceramic shattered against the linoleum floor because he recognized that whistle. He had heard it in his nightmares for 47 years, that same three-note sequence that had been the last sound anyone ever heard from the train before it disappeared into the morning fog. And by the time he made it across the street with his arthritic knees screaming and his heart pounding so hard he thought it might actually stop, the train was just sitting there on the tracks that hadn't seen a locomotive since 1994. A vintage 1972 EMD F40 PH diesel-electric in the faded yellow and grey livery of the Union Pacific, its paint peeling and its windows dark, but otherwise completely intact. As if it had simply been parked there overnight by a negligent crew, and the strangest part, the part that would haunt Earl for the rest of his days, was that there was no snow on the train, none at all, even though a blizzard had dumped 14 inches on Millbrook just 2 days earlier, and the tracks leading up to the station were clear of snow for about 100 yards in either direction. As if the train had materialized out of thin air and simply settled onto the rails like a bird landing on a branch. Earl called the county sheriff, a young woman named Deputy Marlene Cross, who had grown up hearing the stories about the train that vanished and who had always dismissed them as small-town folklore, the kind of tall tale that old men tell to make their boring lives seem more interesting. But when she arrived at the station and saw the locomotive sitting there with steam still rising from its exhaust stack, despite the sub-zero temperatures, she felt something cold crawl up her spine that had nothing to do with the weather, and she ordered the station cordoned off while she called in the state police, the FBI, and eventually the Department of Transportation, because trains do not disappear for 47 years and then simply return with no explanation, and trains certainly do not return with their original passengers still on board, which is exactly what they found when they finally pried open the doors of the first passenger car. The hinges groaning in protest after nearly 5 decades of disuse, and what they saw inside made even the most seasoned investigators step back in disbelief, because the passengers were all there, all 63 of them, sitting in their original seats, dressed in the fashions of 1978, bell-bottom jeans and floral dresses and polyester suits and wide-collared shirts, and they were all alive, breathing, conscious, and completely bewildered. Asking where they were and why everyone was staring at them, and what had happened to the dining car because they were supposed to have breakfast at 7:30 and it was already past that, and the clocks on their wrists, the ones that had been ticking when they left Millbrook, now read 6:47 a.m., December 17, 1978, as if no time at all had passed for them. As if the universe had simply pressed pause on their existence, and then unpaused it 47 years later without bothering to tell anyone. And the first person to step off the train was a young woman named Patricia Harlow, who had been 23 years old on the day she boarded, a schoolteacher from Billings heading to Seattle to visit her sister. And she looked exactly as she had in her passport photo from 1978, not a day older, her auburn hair still pinned in that same style. Her blue eyes wide with confusion as she looked at the station that had once been bustling with travelers and was now a dilapidated shell. And when she asked what year it was and someone told her 2025, she laughed and said that wasn't funny, but then she saw the look on Earl Thompson's face, the old man who had been a teenager when she boarded his train, and she stopped laughing because she recognized something in his eyes, a recognition that went beyond simple memory. Because he had been the dispatcher who had waved goodbye to her through the window of the station office, and now he was old enough to be her grandfather, and that was when Patricia Harlow began to scream, a sound so raw and primal that it echoed off the frozen mountains and sent the crows scattering from the dead trees that surrounded the station, and her screaming triggered something in the other passengers, a collective realization that something had gone terribly, unimaginably wrong. And soon the station was filled with the sound of 63 people, crying and shouting and demanding answers that no one could give them. Because how do you explain to someone that they have been missing for almost half a century, when for them it has been maybe 15 minutes since they last looked out a window and saw the snowy plains of Montana rolling past? The FBI took over the investigation within hours, and they brought in experts from every conceivable field: physicists, psychologists, historians, engineers, even theologians. and none of them could offer a satisfactory explanation for what had happened, because the train itself was a paradox, a physical object that had existed in 1978 and now existed in 2025, with no evidence of having existed in the intervening years, no maintenance records. No refueling logs, no photographs or videos or eyewitness accounts of any kind, and yet it was undeniably real, its metal body solid and cold to the touch, its engine still warm, its fuel tank still 3/4 full of diesel that chemical analysis confirmed was consistent with fuel produced in the late 1970s. And the passengers were even more confounding because they showed no signs of aging whatsoever, their cells' telomeres unchanged. Their DNA unmarked by the passage of time, their memories completely intact up to the moment of departure, and then a blank space where 47 years should have been, and when they were asked to describe the journey, every single one of them gave the same account. They had boarded the train, found their seats, felt the locomotive lurch forward as it always did, watched the station recede through the windows, and then nothing, a void, a darkness, a sensation of falling that lasted for what felt like both an instant and an eternity, and then they were back, sitting in the same seats, looking out the same windows, seeing the same station that they had left behind, and the only difference was that the world outside had changed in ways they could not possibly comprehend. Because the billboard that had once advertised Marlboro cigarettes was now advertising something called CBD gummies, and the gas station across the street had been replaced by a vape shop, and the cars that drove past were unrecognizable, sleek and silent, and glowing with headlights that looked like something from a science fiction movie, and the people who stared at them from behind the police tape were wearing clothes that seemed impossibly casual. Jeans so tight they looked painted on, and jackets made of materials that shimmered and shifted in the light, and the phones. Everyone had phones, flat rectangles of glass and metal that they kept looking at and tapping and holding up to take pictures. And when Patricia Harlow asked what those were, a young FBI agent named Chen tried to explain and watched her face go pale as she realized that the world she had known no longer existed, that her sister in Seattle was likely dead or at least elderly, that her students from Billings were now middle-aged adults with children of their own, that everything she had known and loved had continued on without her while she had been suspended in some kind of temporal amber, and the psychological impact of that realization was devastating, because within the first 72 hours, 2 of the passengers attempted suicide, and 3 others had to be hospitalized for severe dissociative episodes. And the government was forced to quarantine the entire group in a secure facility, while they tried to figure out what to do with 63 people who had technically been dead for almost 5 decades, but were now very much alive and demanding to go home. Except that home no longer existed for most of them, because their homes had been sold or demolished, their spouses had remarried or died, their children had grown up and moved away, their entire lives had been erased by the simple passage of time. And they were ghosts in a world that had moved on without them, and yet they were also the most studied human beings in history, because the scientists who examined them were desperate to understand how they had survived, where they had been, and most importantly, whether it could happen again, because if a train could disappear for 47 years and then return, what else could disappear? What else could return? And that was when things got truly strange, because the investigators who had been combing through the train for evidence of what had happened began to find things that made no sense at all, starting with the dining car, where the tables were still set for breakfast with china that bore the Union Pacific logo and silverware that was tarnished but still serviceable, and the kitchen was stocked with food that should have spoiled decades ago but was still fresh, still warm, still emitting the faint aroma of eggs and bacon and fresh coffee, and when a forensic team tested the food, they found that it was not only edible but perfectly preserved, as if time itself had stopped inside the train and then resumed only when the doors opened. And then they found the manifest, a leather-bound ledger that listed every passenger and crew member on board, and next to each name was a date of birth and a destination and a seat assignment. And everything matched the historical records perfectly except for one thing. At the very bottom of the page, in handwriting that did not match any of the crew members' known penmanship, someone had written a single line that read, "They will return when they are needed," and the ink, when tested, was less than a week old, which meant that someone had been inside the train before it arrived at the station, someone who had access to the train during its 47-year absence, someone who knew it was coming back and had left a message for the people who would find it. And that discovery opened up a whole new dimension of the mystery, because it suggested that the train's disappearance was not a random accident or a natural phenomenon, but something deliberate, something orchestrated by someone or something that had the power to remove a train from existence for almost 5 decades and then return it with its passengers intact. And the question that haunted every investigator was the same. Who had written that note, and what did they mean by "when they are needed"? The investigation expanded exponentially, drawing in intelligence agencies from around the world, because if someone had the technology to do this, they had the technology to do almost anything, and the implications for national security were staggering, but no one could find any evidence of a perpetrator. No fingerprints, no DNA, no surveillance footage, no communications, no financial transactions. Nothing to suggest that any person or organization had been involved in the train's disappearance or its return, and the note itself was the only clue, and it was maddeningly vague, offering no explanation of what the passengers were needed for or who needed them or when that need would become apparent. And as the days turned into weeks and the passengers slowly began to adjust to their new reality, the scientists who were studying them noticed something strange about the way they interacted with each other. A kind of pattern that emerged in their behavior, a synchronization that went beyond normal social dynamics and suggested something deeper, something almost telepathic, because they seemed to know what each other was thinking, to finish each other's sentences, to move in unison in ways that were statistically impossible. And when the researchers subjected them to brain scans, they found that their neural activity was remarkably similar, almost identical in some cases. As if they were all sharing a single consciousness that had been distributed across 63 bodies. And that was when the passengers themselves began to realize that something had changed inside them during their time away, something that they couldn't fully articulate but that they could all feel, a connection to each other that went beyond memory or affection and seemed to be rooted in something fundamental, something that had been awakened in them during their journey through the void, and they started to have dreams. The same dreams, all of them, dreams of a vast, dark space filled with shimmering lights and distant voices that spoke in languages they didn't recognize but somehow understood. Dreams of a place that existed outside of time. A place where past and future were the same thing. A place where the boundaries between individuals blurred and dissolved until there was only one mind, one will, one purpose, and that purpose was to return, to come back to the world they had left behind and to do something that they couldn't quite remember but that felt more important than anything they had ever done before. And as the dreams intensified, they began to act on them, to speak in unison. To move in coordinated patterns that seemed choreographed by some unseen hand, and the scientists who observed them grew increasingly alarmed because they could not explain what was happening, could not predict where it was leading, could not stop it even if they wanted to. And then, on the 47th day after the train's return, the passengers all stood up at exactly the same moment, all 63 of them, and walked toward the door of the facility where they were being held. And when the guards tried to stop them, they simply walked through the guards as if they were made of air, and the guards felt nothing, experienced nothing, remembered nothing except a vague sense of confusion that faded almost immediately. And the passengers walked out of the facility and into the night, and they walked toward the train station in Millbrook, which had been sealed off and guarded around the clock by federal agents. But the agents were powerless to stop them because the passengers simply appeared on the other side of the barricades, as if they had teleported, and they boarded the train, which had been sitting on the tracks for 47 days, and they took their seats, and the engine started on its own, and the whistle blew 3 times, low and mournful and impossibly familiar, and the train pulled away from the station just as the sun was rising over the frozen plains, and it disappeared into the morning fog. And it was never seen again, and the only trace it left behind was a single piece of paper on the platform, a handwritten note that said, "We will return when we are needed," and no one ever figured out who wrote it or where the passengers had gone or what they were waiting for. But sometimes, on cold December mornings in Millbrook, Montana, the old-timers claim they can still hear the whistle blowing in the distance. 3 long notes that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And they know that the train is out there somewhere, waiting for the moment when it will be needed again, and they wonder what that moment will look like, and whether they will be ready for it, and whether anyone will even remember the train at all by the time it finally comes back. Because time has a way of erasing even the most impossible mysteries, and the world has a way of moving on, but the train does not move on, the train waits, the train always waits, and on the frozen plains of Montana, where the wind howls and the snow falls and the years pass like seconds, something is out there in the fog, something that does not belong to this world or any other, something that is patient and ancient and utterly unknowable, and it is waiting for the moment when it will be needed, and that moment is coming, it has always been coming, and when it arrives, the train will return one last time and the passengers will step off, and they will be exactly as they were on the day they left, unchanged, unaged, unaware. The world will finally understand what happened to them, and the answer will be more terrifying than anyone could have imagined, because the train did not disappear by accident, and the passengers did not return by chance, and the note on the manifest was not a warning but a promise that has been kept for 47 years and will be kept again, and again and again until the end of time itself, because some things are not meant to be understood, some things are not meant to be solved. Some things are simply meant to be experienced, and the train is one of those things, a mystery that will outlast every investigator, every scientist, every skeptic who tries to explain it away. And in the end, the only thing that matters is the whistle, 3 long notes that echo across the frozen plains like a prayer, like a warning, like a memory of something that never happened but somehow always will.